When us physical media collectors and movie lovers are talking about the best labels to pick up horror movies on, or which labels have the best catalogs of horror movies, Criterion usually falls somewhere around the bottom of the list. They're not that well known for their catalog of horror movies, but I do think that they have a pretty good or pretty solid selection of horror adjacent movies. I just watched House last night again for the first time in a little while. That's kind of like a good example of the kinds of horror movies you usually get. For this video, I want to go over some of the horror adjacent movies that I watched in October this year. Some of them I already talked about with Matt on the podcast, so if you already heard me and Matt talk about those, I apologize, but double dipping a little bit here. I don't think everybody that listens to the podcast also watches these videos. So without further ado, let's get into it. Okay, the first one I want to talk about and recommend is Onibaba. This is from 1964, and it's a Japanese film by director Kanito Shindo, I believe is how you pronounce his name. This movie is one of the most beautiful black and white movies I've ever seen. The cinematographer Kiyomi Kuroda was able to just create these absolutely hypnotic, haunting imagery in this field where most of the movie takes place, in this tall, grassy like marshland. It explores themes of desperation and survival and the lengths that regular people would be willing to go had they been in the situation that the main characters are in this. The haunting imagery and cinematography and the score as well really back those themes up. The story follows a young woman and her mother-in-law living in seclusion, kind of just outside of civilization. They're forced to kill samurai and sell their armor and weapons and other belongings to get by. Their relationship becomes strained when a friend of the young woman's husband returns home from fighting in the civil war taking place nearby. The man tells them that the young woman's husband, who is also the older woman's son, has been killed. He begins to court the younger woman, and the old woman isn't too happy about it because who's going to help her kill the samurai that wander into their wetlands? So that's the basic setup. From that, you would probably just think this is like a family drama, but I will say the mask on the cover here does come into play. There are some other characters, and some creepy stuff starts happening after a certain point. But if I tell you too much more, that'd be giving away too much of the story, in my opinion. So if you're into Japanese horror movies and you haven't checked this one out yet, I would definitely say Onibaba is worth watching, especially for the cinematography and the score alone. It's just an absolutely hypnotic movie, in my opinion. Yeah. Sorry I can't say much more without spoiling it. I really just don't want to spoil the movie. But yeah, check it out if you're into that stuff. Okay, the next one I have to talk about that I watched in the month of October has a reputation for sure, and that is Salo, or the 120 Days of Sodom. And this is from director Pier Paolo Pasolini, who is a pretty famous Italian director from this era of like the 70s. This is actually the only one of his films that I have seen. But the interesting thing about this movie is the fact that shortly after filming, or shortly after the production was wrapped and the movie was finished, Pasolini actually was murdered. And it's definitely in a way linked to this movie. If you look into it, the story is very interesting. Cliff Notes version of it is basically he was found beaten and run over by a car and even lit on fire. Long story short, a young man was found driving his car around. That young man confessed to the murder, but there's a lot of forensic evidence that says otherwise. The young man was much smaller than Pasolini. Pasolini was like a fit, bigger guy. So there's a lot of evidence pointing to the fact that maybe this guy didn't actually do it. Fast forward 20 or 30 years later, the guy retracts his confession and basically says, yeah, these neo-fascists forced him to do it, or forced him to say that he committed this murder, even though he didn't have anything to do with it. He said that they had threatened his family. Anyways, it's a super interesting but tragic story about how this famous director died. And I would highly encourage anyone who's interested to look into it. It's just a very interesting story. The story basically follows a group of teenagers who are abducted by some very rich and powerful evil people. They are taken to this mansion and forced to commit some horrible acts, and they are tortured and they are assaulted in the worst ways you can think of. One thing that makes the movie not as horrible to watch as I think I had imagined it was going to be when I had heard about the movie was the fact that, being made in the 70s, a lot of the practical special effects and everything are pretty silly. Nothing looks real. It's not like today where if you're watching a Terrifier movie or something where everything looks real and is gross and gory and disgusting. You do see and hear a lot of gross stuff in this movie, but it's clearly fake. And the acting at times isn't the best either. And some of the villains in the movie are just completely over the top ridiculous. One of the guys, his eyes are crossed most of the time. So yeah, while a lot of the stuff that you're seeing and hearing is disgusting, I would say because of the visuals not being on par with like today's visuals, that makes it a little more bearable. My wife and I were even kind of laughing at how hokey some parts of it were. But yeah, that being said, there's definitely some really disgusting stuff in this movie, and it definitely lives up to its reputation. I wouldn't recommend this movie to everybody, only if you're super curious. I definitely was, and I don't know. I'm not sure I can even really say I'm glad I watched it, but I'm glad that I was able to check it off my list. That's Salo. All right, the next one I have to talk about here is a very early slasher. Some consider it a proto-slasher or categorize it as a proto-slasher, but this is from 1960, the same year that Psycho came out, and that is Peeping Tom from director Michael Powell. I've talked about before in my podcast with Matt and in other videos, I think, as well, about how I'm always interested and intrigued by movies where you follow the perspective of the villain or the killer. And this one does that really well, in my opinion. Right from the jump, you know exactly who the killer is. You're following his story throughout the whole movie. And I think it does a really good job of kind of humanizing the villain in a way. Obviously what he does is bad, but it does a good job of explaining kind of his backstory and why he is the way he is. He definitely had a traumatic childhood, and I don't want to say it completely makes you sympathetic for the villain, but it does a good job of explaining his backstory. I'll say that. The killer who you follow throughout the movie is Mark Lewis. He's a cameraman working as a focus puller on a film, and he also moonlights as a photographer taking photos of women either in the nude or in lingerie. And I don't think it's really a spoiler to tell you that Mark is filming these murders that he's doing from the very beginning of the movie. He's filming these women that he's killing, and the reason he's doing it is, I think, to kind of capture true fear. But what's really interesting about this movie isn't all that. That stuff is kind of interesting, but the wrinkle in the story is the fact that he lives in this house that has a few apartments in it, and he has a love interest. One of the women who lives downstairs from him thinks he's cute, thinks he's quirky, thinks he's interesting, and she's interested in him. He kind of has these murderous urges that he gets with her, and he kind of has to hold them back at times. To avoid spoilers, I don't want to say anything else, but that's kind of the gist of the story. So the idea of the villain filming these murders is kind of played out at this point, but back in 1960, I'm sure this was a very novel idea, and I think this has kind of had a critical reappraisal. When it originally came out, I think people didn't like it, critics didn't really like it, but now it's kind of regarded as more of almost a masterpiece. But I really enjoyed this movie. I think if you're into early slashers, early thrillers, psychological thrillers, I think you should definitely give Peeping Tom a shot. This is a really good movie. All right, and the last one I have to talk about here, Matt and I actually also had a pretty good conversation about this movie on an episode of Return to Videotech. I'll link that episode here now. But that is The Vanishing from 1988, the year I was born, actually. And this is a distinctly European film. It's kind of like a very cold feeling movie, not super interesting cinematography. It's not very flashy, but the story is very captivating. And again, you do see a good portion of the movie from the villain's perspective, which I'm always interested in. I found this one to be very frustrating. It's just one of those maddening movies where you're just like angry at the characters for the things that they're doing, the decisions they're making. And it's also just a really tragic story. So basically, it's about this couple who are traveling, and at a gas station, the woman who is the man's wife is abducted at a gas station, and it's a very busy gas station, a place where you probably wouldn't expect an abduction to take place. Or maybe, I don't know, there's a lot of people around. You would think that somebody would have seen what happened. But very interesting thing about the movie is you see up to this point, and then you also see it cuts back and forth in time a little bit here and there, and you see the planning stages of the villain. And kind of like with Peeping Tom, you kind of know who the villain is. Not from the very beginning, but pretty early on in the movie, you know who the villain is, and you're watching him plan out this thing. And the villain is very interesting. He describes himself as a sociopath at one point, and it kind of walks you through his journey, deciding that he wants to do this, and then going through with it. And then there's a time jump where the woman has been missing for a few years, and the man has been looking for her, and it just totally has destroyed him. It's consumed his entire life. I would even say it's almost a depressing movie, especially at the very end. It gets super dark. It's just very interesting because you put yourself in the shoes of the man whose wife was taken, and you can understand why he makes some of the decisions that might seem like stupid decisions. He just really needs to know what happened to his wife, and the villain knows that. So The Vanishing is a very highly regarded movie. I see this pop up in a lot of videos of people's favorites or a lot of recommendation videos, and it lived up to it for me. This was my first time watching it, and yeah, I really enjoyed this movie for even as frustrating as I felt it was. That's The Vanishing. All right, that's going to do it for this video, guys. Thanks for watching. Let me know down in the comments if you've seen any of these movies, what you think of them. Also, if you have any recommendations, let me know. Could be Criterion movies or otherwise. And also, let me know if you're picking up anything in the sale. I went on my lunch break today. I'm recording this on the 7th, so the first day of the sale. And I got a stack of movies to watch and talk about. So yeah, be sure to let me know down in the comments what movies you picked up or what movies you're planning on picking up in the sale this month. All right, thanks again for watching. I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace.